Namaste, friends. Welcome to another evening of satsang together. Let's begin our evening by closing our eyes, centering ourselves, focusing our attention at the point between the eyebrows, offering a silent prayer to Paramhansa Yogananda and to this great lineage of gurus, Mahavatar Babaji, Lahiri Mahashai, Swami Shri Yukteswar Giri. And let's also offer our gratitude to Swami Kriyananda for exemplifying the life of a disciple. I'm going to begin this evening with a chant as usual, and this chant is dedicated to Krishna, the famous Indian deity I'm sure most of you are aware of. The words are very simple, so if you want to sing along, please do. Let's visualize now with our spiritual eye that beautiful form of Lord Krishna. Krishna playing his flute on the banks of the blue river, surrendering our mind to that image of love, compassion. The beautiful blue Lord, in his youth, in his beauty, more charming than anything in this material world, calling to us with the music of his flute. Let our minds float in his thought, engrossed in his presence. Om Shanti. Namaste again, friends. Welcome to the second episode of the series, The Hindu Way of Awakening, or Demystifying Hinduism, depending upon whether you're watching this on Facebook or live stream or YouTube. This week, this is the second part of the series, and we are going to discuss the idea of symbols in religion, mythology, and what gives them the power. Why do we need them? And especially in the context of the Hindu religion, which is what we are studying through this series. And I started this evening with this beautiful chant on Krishna and with his image, because it is such a powerful image. If you have any familiarity with the Indian religion at all, even if you are from the West, I'm sure you've had your own sweet experiences with tuning into Krishna in that image of the divine, that blue-colored young form that is loving, playing his flute, calling to us to come, to offer our hearts in love and devotion. So I thought it's just such a beautiful symbol to begin this evening discussing symbols themselves. What do they mean and how do we understand and apply them? Before I jump into the discussion for today, I want to briefly summarize and recap, almost like a TV series where we have to pick up from where we left. The first class of the series we started discussing last week, and we looked at the idea of Hindu religion and Sanatan Dharma. That was the word we were exploring last week, how it is different from the way we often perceive religion or conceive religion in the West. These ideas of formal religion based on systems of belief, dogma, practices, rituals, that's different from how Sanatan Dharma or Hinduism is practiced. And although there are lots of symbols, lots of stories, lots of scriptures, and many, many practices and rituals and all of that, interestingly enough, this religion is not bounded by any of those. It simply exists because it is the eternal way. It is the way that we are made. It is just us finding all the ways to be naturally in tune with our own inner divine self and to be lifting our consciousness constantly. And the other idea that we touched upon briefly, which we will get to explore even more as we move through this course, is how the custodians of Sanatan Dharma, not just Hinduism, anywhere, any valid expression of Sanatan Dharma, of that true essence of religion in any country or any geography, the custodians are not theologians, not scholars, not people that are in power in institutions, but mystics and saints, those that have the personal experience of the divine, who can speak with authority not by studying, but by actually experiencing states of consciousness that others of us have not. So these are the people that keep this faith, this religion, and these practices alive, and they pour new blood into it every few hundred years, just like the many, many saints that have come from India throughout these past hundreds of years, including Yogananda and these line of gurus who have brought this interpretation of these teachings for us right now. So with that, we will jump right into our topic for today about symbols. What are symbols? Last week I did not have this book to show you. This is Swami Kriyananda's Hindu Way of Awakening. It's kind of the guidebook that I'm using to help us guide these discussions on Hinduism, but also religion in general and how we apply these principles of Sanatan Dharma. And last week I discussed the first chapter of this book, and now we are going to discuss chapter 2, 3, and so on. And Swami starts the second, Swami Kriyananda, I'm going to refer to him as Swami from now on. He starts the second chapter of this book, which is on symbols. He starts by saying symbols are a means of bringing abstract ideas into a focus. Now that's a helpful definition and a good place where we can start. What are symbols? They're just a means, whether they're actual visual images, whether they're sounds, whether they're syllables, whether they're gestures, whatever they are a means for bringing abstract ideas into a form, into a focus, so that we can relate to them. And there are many kinds of symbols, not just in religion. The ring that people wear on their ring finger in the western part of the world, it is a symbol of wedding. So it is such a powerful symbol, whether or not one belongs to any religion or affiliation. That symbol is very important for people. When they are in a married relationship, then they do wear that ring because it means something to them. In the same way, there are other symbols that one can think of, whether it's the American flag or the flag of any nation, you see these images of the first man landing on moon, and what do? They walk, without gravity, sort of floating on the surface of the moon and planting this American flag, or I guess it's an American flag. The Russians also landed on the moon, I remember. But anyway, they put that flag down. And that flag symbolizes something. The flag symbolizes victory, conquest. It is establishing identity, that which you are relating to, that which you consider your source. The flag is symbolizing all of that. When the soldiers fall down, they cannot let the flag down because it is a symbol of honor and dignity. In the same way, even there's a lot of political controversy around paying respect for the national anthem and all of that. How do you, whether you stand, whether you sit, whether you kneel, I'm not quite aware of all the implications of all of that, but I remember that from the news, and I'm quoting it here because these are all symbols. The gestures, the visuals, and the objects, whatever they are, they're symbolic of something, and they're not just confined to religion. That's why I'm giving all these random examples, because symbols relate to so many things in our lives, and that's how we bring ideas into form. That's how we express themselves in this world. Now, we started, of course, this class with the symbol of Lord Krishna, a very, very famous and well-known symbol, a deity from the Hindu religion. I'm calling Krishna a symbol. Of course, Krishna was also a living individual, as Yogananda ji says. He was somebody who actually walked the plane of this earth, who was an avatar, who was a pure descent of the divine consciousness, who played into the human drama. But for our practical purposes, because we have deified this person, this individual, and this particular form in very specific ways, whether it's the baby that is crawling with butter in his hands, or whether it's the young man standing the way he is right now, as you're seeing behind me, playing the flute, standing with Radha, who is his consort, who is his lover, or the image of Krishna on the chariot with Arjuna sitting behind him. These are all symbols that we have deified, and we are tuning into that state of consciousness that this individual soul, Krishna, represented when he walked on this earth. Now, when you think of a symbol like that, the question that we are left to ask is this symbol relevant only for Hindus? Of course, I grew up in the Indian faith. I grew up deeply devoted to these images and symbols. They are very special to my heart. When I see an image of Krishna, my heart simply rises in devotion naturally. When I sing these chants, when I sing Indian songs in praise of Krishna, I'm immediately lifted in that devotional feeling. But is that only because I have certain associations and memories of this image, or I've been told that that's how I'm supposed to feel? And if somebody has no context, of course, if you think of somebody in the West who, let's just say, which is perhaps unlikely in today's time and age, because we all are so internationally exposed to different cultures and different symbols all over the world. Let's just say there's somebody in your life who has never seen any Indian god, who has never seen a picture or an image of an Indian deity, who has no clue who Krishna is, what he looks like, and you show them this picture of Krishna. What would they feel? Would that symbol mean anything to them? Or would it just be a piece of art, a religious art, exotic piece from some culture that they're not familiar with? And for me or others who grow up deeply in that faith, Krishna just symbolizes this form of divine that's loving, compassionate, that is calling to us, that is charming, that is so irresistible that you want to leave everything aside and just run to Krishna. So, is that just a figment of belief? Are symbols, the power of the symbols, do they come just because our mind gives them that power, or is there more to it? Now, that's a subtle question which we are going to try and answer in this class, so you have to hold on as we discuss more things. But before we actually tackle that question directly, what we have to understand, where Swami Kriyananda starts this discussion on symbols, is with this concept or idea that everything in this universe is, after all, symbolic. Because first of all, if you understand creation itself from the perspective of Sanatan Dharma, all of that we'll study later on in this course, there is the pure formless spirit, the spirit that is beyond vibration, beyond creation, and this spirit vibrates. And this is not just the Hindu version of Genesis. This is what the Bible says. There are different ways in which the ideas are communicated, and it almost sounds like they are talking about different things, but in fact they're all talking about the same principles. What they're talking about is this formless spirit, the God consciousness, which was outside of vibratory creation, and the very first vibration, what the Bible calls the word and what the Hindus call the Om sound, Ohm vibration, that's what happens first. And from that Ohm vibration there is more and more vibrations of thoughts and ideas, which later on start to vibrate even more and more to create patterns of energy. And finally these patterns of energy manifest as the gross plane, as the material plane, as objects of senses. And all of us, everything in creation, including the trees, the universes, all the planets, all of the animals and plants on this particular planet, and all of our thoughts, everything comes from that formless divine through this vibration. That's how Sanatan Dharma explains it. Now, if all of that feels like a stretch to you, just keep it aside for right now. It's not as relevant for our discussion right away. But this context is helpful because in that broad perspective and sense, everything on this material plane is but a symbolic reflection of something from a subtler plane. All that we see, all the material objects are but energy. That's essentially what Paramhansa Yogananda even explains in the autobiography of a yogi, that we have come into this age where we have developed this ability to understand this universe itself as a manifestation of energy rather than being just solid matter that cannot be manipulated. So in that sense, all of our experiences in this plane are after all symbolic. Words are symbolic, language is symbolic. I'm speaking to you right now as if I'm communicating truth, but I'm not. What I'm using are simply words, and words, are symbols that sort of tie our experiences together. I can communicate ideas in my mind, things that I'm thinking, and I can put symbols on top of them, and somehow when I say them in a right sequence and in a way, perhaps you understand what I'm saying. And in that way, all of these things are just symbolic. So in a sense, it's hard to even distinguish what a symbol is and what is not a symbol, what is literal and what is symbolic. That's what I'm getting at here. And in religion, we take symbols to another extent. We sort of stretch them out because we start using things that can actually be perceived through the senses, whether it's visual, whether it's auditory, whether it's an image, whether it's a gesture. What we do is we use them to denote things that are subtler realities. And this idea is of course not specific to Hindu religion or Sanatan Dharma. Every religion uses symbols. The cross is perhaps the most popular or the most well-known religious symbol in the whole world. What does the cross represent? Of course, there is the literal story of Jesus Christ carrying the cross and being crucified. But truly what the cross represents is a universal symbol. Cross represents conflict. It represents two opposing forces. The force that is center, the line in the middle, is that aspiration of the soul, and the force that crosses it, the material delusion, and all that holds us back from realizing that potential. Now, this symbol is also given additional context through the life of Jesus and the power that he brought to this planet, because he converted this cross, this obstacle that was holding back, that is holding back our soul from realizing its potential, into an opportunity by offering into it, by offering himself upon this cross, by lifting the cross, by being crucified on it. He elevated the symbol even further. And when Christians around the world, when we all tune in to that symbol, what we are doing in essence is, of course, tuning into that symbol of conflict itself, that inner conflict between soul's aspiration and the challenges that the material plane presents. But we're also tuning into that example of Jesus, of transcending that, of transcending all those limitations and using everything that comes to us on this plane as an opportunity to lift ourselves up. Thy will be done. That was Jesus' famous words before he got crucified on the cross. To offer ourselves ever more fully at the feet of the divine with absolute complete renunciation, to be in tune with that divine flow. And all of this gets communicated just with that one symbol. So in that sense, the symbol has a lot of power. In all religions around the world, we use these symbols. Just that two lines intersecting each other now has come to mean so much more. Not just two lines, even when you see it in a physical structure, on a construction site or anywhere else, even you draw it on a paper, immediately it means something. It starts to reflect something. It starts to reflect a state of consciousness. And similarly, there are also symbols that even have inherent power. I was just talking about creation as it's explained in Sanatan Dharma. One cannot forget to talk about the symbol of Ohm itself, the sound Ohm. Most often people that are not exposed to Eastern faith also, they might be familiar with it because that's what the yoga instructors chant at the end or the beginning of the yoga class. They know Namaste and Om because that's very common in the West for whoever practices yoga. But that symbol of Om, just that sound, the chanting of that sound, has come to mean so much. Now, others who are familiar with it or who are even deeply tuning into this sound of Om may not be able to explain in all these words about the principles of creation and Sanatan Dharma as I'm doing right now. But still, that sound, simply hearing it, simply chanting it, gives them a doorway to access that reality. The Om, that's why I call it the Ohm vibration, because in essence it's not a syllable. It's not a sound that can actually be vocalized. What we chant through our mouth, through our tongue, is simply the closest physical reflection of what that vibration truly feels like. But even in that close physical reflection, there is a lot of power. A power in this case which is also beyond a figment of the mind or of belief, because when somebody chants Om, one can feel it. It is not a question of whether you're Hindu, whether you're Christian, whether you're Muslim, or whatever religious faith you belong to. I remember, I think it was Swami Kriyananda shares a story of how when Yoganandaji would chant Om powerfully during his Sunday services when he gave public sermons, those in the room that had too many negative thoughts or somehow were out of tune with what he was sharing, they couldn't even bear to be in the room because the uplifting power of that sound and that vibration was so intense that other states of consciousness could not even exist in its presence. So there is a reality, there is a power to that symbol of sound that is beyond just what somebody might think or somebody might imagine. This is one of those places where it transcends just that imagination of the mind or of belief, where there is true power to the symbol itself. And in a sense, how much power we feel from a symbol, how much can a symbol actually affect our lives, is not a function of the symbol, but of us. And this is one of the fundamental concepts that we will explore and revisit again and again as we go through this discussion this evening. I hope what I'm saying is clear. What I mean by that is whether or not you feel inspired by looking at a cross, whether or not you feel inspired by chanting to Krishna or by listening to the sound of Om or whatever it is not the power of the symbol itself, but the power that resides in our own consciousness. Because the more refined we get, the more attuned we are to higher states, that the moment it is symbolically reflected, we are able to tune into it. I'm going to read it the way Swami Kriyananda puts it. Well, I'm not quite sure where in the chapter it is. Later on in the talk, if I'm able to find it, I'll read it for you. But in essence, what he states is, the more elevated, the more refined we become spiritually, the more receptive we all become to all of these symbols. Think about it for yourself. Even something as simple as inspiring natural scenery or landscapes or whatever they are, when you're looking at the ocean, when you're looking at a broad vista of some beautiful scenery, when you're doing a long hike and standing on the mountaintop, looking into the valley, you're looking from a high point into snow-capped peaks everywhere in the Himalayas. I myself personally have had the great good fortune of doing backpacking trips in the Himalayas and visiting many holy places very, very high up in the mountains beyond all human civilization. And I remember how deeply inspiring every moment is as you walk amidst these large snow-capped peaks. each scenery more inspiring than the other, and there are no words to describe any of this. I can show pictures, I take pictures and I share it with my friends, but they are so rudimentary, it's impossible to communicate the actual feeling of beholding that scenery in person. And for those of you who have hiked in that way, you might also know from experience that sometimes there are these animals that come with you. There are often dogs that follow you on hikes, and I remember this was probably many, many years ago, even 10 years ago, that I was on one such hike and there was this dog. No, I don't know whether it belonged to somebody, whether it was a mountain dog, and I thought this dog was just following me for maybe an hour or so, but it just kept following me to the next campsite, and I gave it food, and then it came with me the next day. And I was standing there on this mountaintop looking at this broad vista with so many snow-capped peaks, and the dog is right there next to me and it's rolling in the dirt and it's sort of having its own version of fun. Now, the dog, I'm not sure, finds this vista as inspiring. The dog may not find as much motivation to actually exert itself physically to climb to the mountaintop just to see the scenery. Now, this is what I was meaning when I said how much we are inspired by the symbol itself is not a function of the symbol. The symbol is simply what it is. And by definition, when we say, when we call something a symbol, it has already been reduced to the material plane. It is something that we see, something we hear, something we do, something that can be touched. All of these things are brought down to the plane of the senses. So something that is so sensory, so physical, and so tangible, for it to have power to lift us beyond what is physical, does not just lie in its own inherent capacity. Where it lies is in the receptivity of our consciousness. And this is where Sanatan Dharma gives context to all of these symbols in a much better and broader way. Now, the dog does not obviously find the mountain scenery inspiring, or it's not going to enjoy sunset on a beach, but all of us humans, whether or not we consider ourselves spiritual, we draw deep inspiration from nature because it is symbolic. Why do we find that vista from the top of a mountain inspiring? Why do we find the ocean sunset so beautiful? Why do we feel so rejuvenated when we walk through a forest? Now, I don't know, perhaps there are scientific reasons to all of this, but the most self-evident reason is simply that it is reminding us of something. It is reminding us of something expansive, something joyful, something soaring upwards. There's a lot more symbolism that can be said about all of that. I'm going to reserve that again for later chapters of this book. But all that it comes down to is, even without needing to be explained, even without something need to be put into words, that scenery in itself holds this power of a symbol that is able to inspire us. And this is not just about nature. You can extend it to so many things in our life. Just think of motherhood, which is one of the examples that Swami Kriyananda gives in that chapter. This this image of a mother holding a child. What do you think of when you see that? Again, something completely outside of religion or spirituality. It doesn't matter whether Sanatan Dharma or Hinduism mean anything to you. But when you see such an image of a mother holding a child, immediately what comes to our mind is selfless love, is compassion, is that sweetness, is that self-sacrifice. We feel a warmth in our own hearts by seeing such an image. We are so touched even by seeing a painting of a mother holding a child, let alone thinking of the sweet memories one might share with their own mother, or actually seeing a mother and her child in action. That symbol, how does it have that power? You can think of the same with other animals in the animal kingdom. I remember once I was going on a hike somewhere in the Bay Area where I live, and this was a park by the ocean. This was a state park. It's called Año Nuevo, and I happened to be there in a time where the elephant seals were breeding, and these are these creatures that are huge, that weigh hundreds and hundreds of pounds, and I don't even know how to describe all these small babies, I don't know what they're called, of elephant seals suckling on their mothers. Now, I'm not sure whether the other elephant seals that are watching this find it as poignant and as touching and as sweet as we humans relate to motherhood. Now, what gives us that capacity? Why does this inspire us? Why does it evoke feelings in us that somehow the animals cannot experience? It's because our consciousness is more refined, because we can feel on that level. And that's where Swami Kriyananda says, as we refine our conscious more and more, as we become more and more spiritually evolved, these symbols become so powerful that we are extremely deeply touched by them. And our own receptivity to how much these symbols can influence us relies so heavily on how deeply we can feel. It is also a tangent here, which again Swami Kriyananda just mentions as he goes through the chapter, is it also reflects for us or indicates for us how higher and higher spiritual states are not somehow accompanied by this dry intellectuality or this extreme dispassion to things of this world. There is dispassion to things of this world, of the material world, but it's not that same kind of indifference to this world, but rather it is this deep feeling nature that we start developing as we grow spiritually. I want to share a story for you right now to just illustrate that point. I'm going to read an excerpt from the book, The Gospel of Ramakrishna. This is a story from the life of Ramakrishna, the great avatar, the great saint who lived in India. Again, just to illustrate the power of symbol. This is a story, it's an interesting story the first time I heard it, which was perhaps when I was a child. And since then, I've always meditated on the purport or the meaning of the story, because it's something that is worth contemplating about. And I'm going to read from the original text of the Gospel of Ramakrishna, which is the autobiographical account of the saint's life. And this is an incident that happened when Ramakrishna, his name was Gadadhar, that was the given name by his parents, when he was only 6 or 7 years old. This is his first experience of touching cosmic consciousness. At the age of 6 or 7, Gadadhar, Ramakrishna's birth name, had his first experience of spiritual ecstasy. One day in June or July, when he was walking along a narrow path between paddy fields, eating the puffed rice that he carried in a basket, he looked up at the sky and saw a beautiful dark thundercloud. As it spread, rapidly enveloping the whole sky, a flight of snow-white cranes passed in front of it. The beauty of the contrast overwhelmed the boy. He fell to the ground unconscious, and the puffed rice went in all directions. Some villagers found him and carried him home in their arms. Gadadhar said later in that state he had experienced an indescribable joy. Now, in the Gospel of Ramakrishna was originally written in Bengali, and in other translations of it, this version is even translated differently. This was the one I found on the internet. But the reason I wanted to share this story with all of you is I can imagine myself looking at the dark thunderclouds in the sky, and I can easily imagine a flock of cranes flying in front of it, and I would be enjoying its beauty, maybe take my phone out to get a picture, or even just share and be inspired or uplifted by it. But I'm not sure that I would go into a state of samadhi, that I would fall unconscious on the ground. I'm not sure if I would be reminded of that contrast. I was saying in some versions of translations of the same passage from Bengali, it talks about how this contrast of the dark and the white reminded him of the interplay of elements in creation, of the yin and yang, of Shiva and Shakti, of the masculine and the feminine. And this interplay is the essence of creation itself and of all beings. And somehow when Gadadhar, that 6-year-old boy, who of course did not have any philosophy in his mind, he did not have all these complex ideas that we all have right now that I'm sharing with you, but he looked at the sky, he looked at these dark clouds, and he looked at this flock of cranes flying in front of it, and immediately that symbol evoked this powerful response in him that he went into that state of samadhi. And that is the power of symbols. Symbols bypass the mind. Symbols truly have this power. I'll read something else which I can find. Again, just to say it in Swami Kriyananda's words, because they're better put than anything that I can express. Symbols are an affirmation of affiliation, belief, or devotion, and they command sometimes deep loyalties. Their appeal to human nature bypasses the necessity of thinking through a concept from the beginning whenever the subject is raised. That really where the power of symbols lie. The power of symbols lie in the fact that they bypass the rational mind. This rational mind that always has to put things in context of causality, of space and time, that can never understand the subtle truths. Last week, I know I shared a quote by Saint Teresa of Avila, a great Christian saint. Perhaps I'll find that here right now. Well, I'm not going to keep looking in the book as I'm speaking, but where she was saying, I'll paraphrase it perhaps right now, what one can experience even in a moment of ecstasy, the amount of realization and awareness that can come even from that one instant of spiritual ecstasy cannot compare or cannot be attained even with years of thought and study and contemplation. That's really where the power of symbols lie, because they bypass the mind, they make accessible to us things otherwise that we may not have access to. And now we come to that actual question that sort of I evaded from in the beginning of the class, where we were talking about whether the power that the image of Krishna had to uplift consciousness, was it just a figment of human imagination or belief, or does that symbol actually have some inherent power, just like the sound of Om, to inherent anybody and everybody? Now, it's a subtle and layered question, and I don't know if there is a categorical answer that can be given to that, but I'm going to share some of Swami Kriyananda's writings that helps us sort of understand the principles behind it. The more deeply attuned, now this is about what I was sharing a few minutes ago. I'm glad I found this quote by Swami. The more deeply attuned we become to divine consciousness, the more inspiring and uplifting for us are the symbols that represent that consciousness. The more we become attuned to the spiritual concepts behind a symbol, the more immediate its effect on us. It is not gradual as the intellect labors to understand and absorb them. For symbolism is a bridge not only between evident and subtle realities, but even between the familiar and the unfamiliar, the known and the unknown. I don't think I can say it better than that. And that explains to us that story of Ramakrishna, how powerful, why all of us are not just walking on the streets and traffic and looking at the dark clouds and the flock of cranes and not going into samadhi. But Ramakrishna couldn't stop himself from having that state of spiritual ecstasy. He fell unconscious on the ground and he had to be carried away by the villagers. And now, this is where Swami says, there is a potential for symbols to exert a definite power on the mind, more so than most people are consciously aware of. And this is that subtle question of, will the symbol be powerful for me if I don't understand it? And it becomes a two-way street, it becomes a two-way function. If we are in fact able to see the divine reflected in the image of Krishna and tune into it, if we are able to in fact consider the possibility that this might be a form of divine, this might be a form through which God can come to me, and even if we approach it with that slight receptivity, immediately what the power of the symbol, the power that the symbol carries in it, is it gives us so much more than what we can consciously aware of and grasp. Which is to say, the power that the symbol has, the power that we ourselves draw out of these symbols and the effect that it has on us is a function of both. It is a little bit of receptivity, what I earlier called that figment of belief, that commitment and the openness with which we approach it. But a lot of it is also in the symbol itself. Like, when we chant Om, just as I was saying with the mountain sceneries and elephant seals and dogs, the dogs and elephant seals may not be able to perceive that as a spiritually uplifting power. But now, if we were able to close our eyes, bring our attention to that spiritual eye and somehow tune into that sound with even a teeny bit of receptivity, then the power that flows through that symbol to somehow transcend the evident material reality and take us into a subtle reality is multiplied 100 times. And that is why Sanatan Dharma, Hinduism, relies so heavily on symbols. I'll read further from what Swami writes. For this reason, the ancient rishis or sages of India have decided to give outward expression to their inner realizations. For this reason, the ancient rishis or sages of India, having decided to give outward expression to their inner realizations, did not limit themselves to simply describing them in their writings. To affect people's consciousness more deeply, they offered allegories and symbols. The power of suggestion. By suggestive images, they tried to build bridges, however tenuous, between the world of the senses and the reality they perceived, which was permeated with divine bliss. And this is the summary of what we are studying with symbols. By suggestive images, they tried to build this tenuous bridge. Why is it tenuous? Because we are in fact talking about things that are on the plane of the senses, on the material plane, on these physical realities. Whether it's a statue of Krishna that you're seeing behind me, or whether it's the sound of Om, whether it's a beautiful piece of music, whatever it is, whether it's a cross that you wear, it is in fact a material reality. But even a little bit of receptivity that we bring into it, it has this enormous power to lift us out of this reality and to reveal to us subtler and subtler realities which our conscious mind cannot grasp. And as Swami Kriyananda explains, that is why rishis, the ancient sages, decided to express their realization not just through words, which they did, but it is hard and perhaps less accessible through all the scriptures and the commentaries that have been written over thousands of years, but rather what has survived, what gives Hinduism the power. What do people think of when they think of Hinduism? They think of the gods and goddesses, the many hands, the many faces, the many heads, the rituals, the flower garlands, the beautiful saris, the incense, the arati, and the symbols and the kirtans and all of that. All of these are symbols. Are these simply external charades that somehow have been created by man's mind simply to engage and do something? Not really. In fact, it is something that touches upon that material plane closely, and if one were to just approach it with complete lack of awareness or lack of receptivity, all of this is but an external charade. This song does not mean anything. This image of Krishna is but a beautiful piece of art done by an artist in metal, by a skilled artist, and you can admire it for its artistic beauty, but it may not carry in it that same quality to inspire devotion in your heart. But if we were to approach it, as I was saying, with that attitude of and willingness to be able to see God in that image, then it has its power. And I remember growing up, even as a child, I was not going to states of samadhi as Ramakrishna was, but even beholding that image, standing in line, for those of you that grew up in India or even visited India, I'm sure you're aware of what I'm describing, standing in these long winding lines in temple, in these crowded places, you walk inch by inch by inch after a few hours, and then you're in front of the sanctum sanctorum, beholding this form of the god or the goddess, elaborately decorated. There's a priest performing rituals, and you're barely there for 2 minutes, and yet it has such power. You're so fulfilled, you're so uplifted, you're so inspired. You just have seen God. That's not a statue, that's not an idol. What you are seeing, what you're beholding is God himself or herself. And that power is two ways. It comes from our receptivity and also the power of the symbol itself. And that is why the rishis, the great sages of India, they create these symbols. Now, formal religion has this temptation to institutionalize them, to put them into rigid boundaries, because that's what happens when things are brought down to the material plane. They immediately get tainted by ego, and men of this world might even use the symbol to exert power on others. But this is where, as we were discussing last week, we have to differentiate between the way of belief, the way of practice, and the way of awakening. When we are able to see it in context, when we can keep coming back to what the purpose of all of this is, then we realize that this is not of this world. This image of Kali, this image of Krishna, this chant, this mantra that I'm repeating, this flower garland that I just made, this offering that I'm putting on my altar, this is not just food that I prepared on my stove. This is actually my heart's devotion now in this bowl. Now I'm presenting it to the divine. And Yogananda ji, that's where the path of self-realization is so grounded in its own understanding of reality and how we work with it. He discouraged us from taking these symbols as literal realities and pledging blind loyalty to them. This is a direct quote from the autobiography of a yogi, where Yogananda ji says, "Devotion must be kept in a state of reason lest it become fanatical." Now, I have to read it again. Devotion must be kept in a state of reason. Now, in the same book, in Autobiography of a Yogi, Yogananda ji also talks about how devotion is the highest virtue, how feeling is a much deeper, essential reality of who we are than the mind or intellectual thinking. So when he says devotion must be kept in a state of reason, he's not talking about putting logic or reasoning or the brain or the mind above the heart's feelings and devotion. That's not what he's talking about. As Swami Kriyananda ji explains, what he's really describing is not to focus on these symbols so closely that we lose the broader perspective. We should keep in mind their meaning is larger than the symbols themselves, and we should therefore never lose sight of that larger meaning altogether. That is why certain scriptures advise one to develop other-mindedness. I won't go further. But that again is an important lesson. As we tune into that image of Krishna, we can't become blindly dogmatic to think that, oh, maybe Ganesha is my favorite deity. There's an actual elephant-headed being sitting somewhere waiting for me, and that now all these people who do not believe in Ganesha, all these Christians are just so foolish and so ignorant that they are not aware of this other person with this elephant head and who's so benevolent and who's so wise sitting there to bestow all boons on me. That's not what we are doing here. It's not that the Christian and Hindu realities are somehow opposing each other, that the Christian God is this old man with a white beard and the Hindu God is this, fat chubby boy with an elephant face. Not really. All God himself is just pure consciousness. That's where we have to put these symbols in context. As much as for me, Kali is God. My God is this naked woman wearing a garland of skulls, her tongue out, with 4 hands, with hair floating in all directions. She is the mother of this universe. She is all compassionate, dark colored, with bright eyes, always loving, always watching over me. She is my God. But at the same time, I don't get confused with this fact that to somebody else, she might be perceived in a completely different form. For somebody else, the same Kali might look like this young boy who's blue-colored, who's standing on the banks of Yamuna playing flute. For somebody else, the same Kali that I'm so devoted to is going to be an ascetic with a trident, and they are going to call him Shiva, and he's going to be sitting on the Himalayan mountains wearing tiger skin. And for somebody else, the same Kali, the same God I'm devoted to constantly is going to look like this, elephant-faced being who's so benevolent and wise and kind, and who's going to remove all obstacles from their path. All of these aspects, all of these symbols are all pointing to that same one essential reality. And when we tune into them, we are tuning into that reality. We are as loyal to the symbol as we are to God himself. So it is real to us because of our commitment, and for us to harness the power of that symbol and to tune into the consciousness that produced that symbol. But at the same time, as Swami Kriyananda and Yogananda ji counsels us here, we do not want to lose that broader context of the meaning and the sense of all of it together. Because for Christians, this God is going to look different. They are going to think that I'm crazy to be seeing God as a naked lady with hair flying in all directions and who's just so dark colored with her tongue sticking out. It's going to just look strange, and that's perfectly fine because my mother is my mother. I do not need somebody else to agree with my forms of divine and my relationship and my love for God. But I also want to be respectful and understand, not just respectful, it is not that I'm respecting and tolerating somebody else's ignorance, but simply that when I am in tune with the essence of what that form represents, essence of what Sanatan Dharma is and what the symbol means to me, then I understand that Saint Francis can be a saint that I can tune into. As much as he never perhaps knew about the symbol of Kali, he never tuned into her. He tuned into God in the form of his son Jesus Christ, as Jesus Christ is his only channel through which he can touch that infinite spirit. And his devotion and his vibration are equally inspiring to me, and I can use that to tune in to Kali herself, because it is all the same essence of the divine that we are tuning into. The Indian system, the Sanatan Dharma that was fostered and nurtured in the Indian land, is so filled with symbols, and each of these symbols is so rich with so many lessons to teach us. I did have a few more stories to share with you today, but I think I'm going to perhaps reserve them for next week. I did want to read a few things for you before I finish this class. These are some quotations from the great researcher and scholar Joseph Campbell. As I was meditating on these symbols last week, I couldn't help but watch some of the video footages of Joseph Campbell. For those of you who don't know who I'm talking about, he was this great, wise scholar. He was like a sage who understood world mythology and religions, and he had this very, very broad and universal perspective on spirituality with which he explained all the symbolism in the great religions of the world. And these are words from one of his writings. "For the symbols of mythology are not manufactured. They cannot be ordered, invented, or permanently suppressed. They are the spontaneous productions of the psyche, and each bears within it, undamaged, the germ power of its source." That is such a beautiful way of summarizing all of this, because as we tune into these symbols, the reason why they are so important, why are these forms and rituals and songs and chants and all of that, which are part of this Hindu Indian culture, relevant and important for us? Because they carry in them the germ power of their source. All the great rishis, all the great beings who revitalized Sanatan Dharma over thousands of years, their attunement to the divine is captured in all these symbols. In all these writings, we are tuning into Yoganandaji, who was just 100 years before us, through the chants he left, through the writings, through his image. In the same way, what Sanatan Dharma presents for all of us is a way to tune into all the great souls, the avatars, mystics and saints that came to bring these expressions of divine, to give us these doorways to be able to tune into things that are subtler than the material plane. I'm going to read a little bit more because it's also fascinating. You can find on the internet these interviews of Joseph Campbell that are in video. I was watching a lot of that this past week as I was preparing for this talk, where he's being interviewed and asked questions about the power of myth and symbols and world religions and all of that. And this is one of those questions. I found this transcript from the internet, and I'm just going to share a brief excerpt with you before I finish. "What does myth do for us? Why is it so important?" So this is the interviewer asking this question to Mr. Campbell, and this is his answer. "Symbols and myths puts you in touch with a plane of reference that goes past your mind into the very being of your essence, into your very gut. The ultimate mystery of being and non-being transcends all categories of knowledge and thought. Yet, that which transcends all talk is the very essence of your own being, and you're resting on it, and you know it. The function of mythological symbols is to give you a sense of, aha, yes, I know what it is. It is myself." That is what it's all about. And then you feel a kind of centering all the time. And whatever you do can be discussed in relationship to this ground of truth. Though to talk about it as truth is a little bit deceptive, because we think of truth as something we can conceptualize. All of this goes past that. Now, obviously reading it is like reading a Zen koan where he's saying this is truth, and yet it's not. It's known and it's unknown, and yet we find our own ground of truth upon something that cannot really be expressed on this plane. And that perhaps is the only way to put it, because what we are finding through these symbols is a way to relate to realities that are beyond this plane. I forgot to tell you one thing which is related to this topic. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, in Judaism, which is the Jewish faith, God is never referred to. I forget what it's called, the 4 syllables or the symbols they use for representing God. They never say the word, because the word for God cannot be uttered, because it is not a sound. It is not something that can be expressed through the senses. So the Hebrew word is simply the name. When they say the name, they're referring to the God, because God is nameless for all practical purposes, and it's impossible to somehow put a symbol on him. Now, of course, the Hindu religion had to bypass that and sort of had to do whatever it could in order to put all the names and symbols. But there is a sense, there is this kernel of truth even in that Jewish tradition of not putting a name for God, because ultimately the essence of truth cannot be expressed on this plane. And yet we try, because by our own attunement, by our own receptivity through all these names and forms, we do find doorways to approach the divine. We do find our ground of truth, as Mr. Campbell so beautifully put it. In this, we find our ground of truth. In my relationship to Kali, I find my ground of truth. I don't expect that everybody else relate to God in that way. I don't even think of it as objective truth. It is my reality and my personal relationship with divine. And when I see any form of God, when I see a beautiful vista in nature, when I see these flowers, when I see love being expressed, when I see kindness, when I see all beauty, when I see things that are terrible, when I see a thunderstorm, all that I'm reminded of is Kali, that one ground of truth, something that is not of this plane, the animating force, the power of the Creator Himself that is behind all of this. And through that symbol, it gives me a conscious way of tuning into it all the time. And through that one symbol, now as I was saying earlier on in this talk, everything in this world starts to become a symbol. That reality, that all of this is simply a veneer, simply a superficial reflection on the surface, starts to become more and more apparent to us. And that is the objective of Sanatan Dharma, to realize that this world is not what it looks like. And in that sense, all these symbols, whether it's Kali, whether it's the cross, whether it's Ganesha, whether it's whatever religious symbols that we are talking about, they're far more real. They're not just a figment of human imagination. They're not just a figment of belief. They're more true than anything that we can experience in this world. But as again, to quote Mr. Campbell before I finish, it is deceptive to state it that way because it is not the kind of truth that can be conceptualized by the human mind. It is the kind of truth that is of a completely different plane which informs and guides this plane. It gives us a ground. It gives us solid ground on which we can stand and relate to this plane while being guided by something that is far more subtler, and it's much more closer to the true essence of who we are in our own being. So with that apparent paradox and irony, I'll end this talk. I hope you're enjoying this. Thank you all for who wrote to me after last week's class, and I'm very happy to hear from all of you. If you have any questions, any thoughts about things I'm sharing here, anything that's not clear enough, anything that you would like me to expand more, I'm happy to. I'm realizing, which I knew before I started this series, that I'm not going to be able to finish this entire book in the span of 4 weeks that I'm committed to doing this series. So in the next week or so, I'll share with you more about how we can continue studying this book. I'm planning to host a kind of a satsang group where we can all meet, perhaps not just me speaking with you, but perhaps we can come together to study Sanatan Dharma and to study these teachings in the light of Yoganandaji's expressions and teachings and the teachings of self-realization, and use each other's experiences and perspective to find satsang and grow together. So more on that later. I love to hear from all of you. Let me know if you have any questions or thoughts, and I would be happy to answer them. I'm not checking them live as I'm speaking, but if you were to either drop it in comments or write to me, I'll be able to address them in the next lecture. So until I meet you next week, God bless you.